What if the strongest army on paper could no longer fight its own war without begging another country for soldiers? That is the uncomfortable question hanging over the Kremlin right now, and the answer is far more revealing than Moscow ever wanted the world to see. Before we go any further, hit that like button, tap subscribe, and send this video to one friend who still thinks this war is only about Russia and Ukraine, because by the end of this video, you will understand it is actually a story about 3 countries, not 2, and the third one might change everything you thought you knew about global power. For more than 3 years, Russia has poured men, machines, and money into a war that was supposed to last a few weeks. It has not ended. Instead, it has slowly eaten away at something Russia cannot easily replace: its own people. Every single month, thousands of Russian soldiers are killed or wounded along the front lines. Recruitment offices now offer enormous cash bonuses just to convince ordinary men to sign contracts. Prisons have been emptied of convicts in exchange for a place on the battlefield. Debt collectors, unemployed workers, and men from poor rural regions have been targeted by aggressive recruitment campaigns, often with promises of money that many families desperately need to survive rising prices back home. And even after all of that, it still has not been enough to fill the gaps left behind by years of relentless fighting. On top of the manpower problem, years of heavy international sanctions have squeezed Russia's economy in ways that are not always visible from the outside. Access to advanced technology has been restricted. Trade routes have been cut off or rerouted through countries willing to quietly look the other way. Weapons production, while still running, depends more and more on components and raw materials that used to come from the West and now have to be found elsewhere, often at a much higher cost. None of this has stopped the war, but all of it has made the war far harder and far more expensive to sustain than anyone in the Kremlin likely expected back in 2022. So Russia did something almost nobody expected when this war began. It quietly turned to a country most of the world tries hard to ignore: North Korea. To understand how strange this is, you need to remember what North Korea usually represents on the world stage. It is one of the most isolated nations on Earth, cut off from global trade, watched constantly by satellites, and treated for decades as a problem to be contained rather than a partner to be trusted. Yet here we are, watching that same isolated nation become one of the most important allies keeping Russia's war machine running. It started in 2024, when Ukrainian forces launched a surprise operation and pushed across the border into Russia's own Kursk region, capturing hundreds of square kilometers of Russian territory. For the first time since World War II, foreign troops were occupying Russian soil. It was a humiliation Vladimir Putin could not simply ignore, and it exposed a painful truth that Russia's own forces were stretched too thin to properly defend their own homeland while still fighting deep inside Ukraine. To push Ukraine back out of Kursk, Moscow turned to Kim Jong Un, and North Korea answered by sending thousands of its own soldiers to fight and die on a battlefield thousands of kilometers away from anything they had ever known. At first, both governments refused to admit it was happening. When diplomats were asked directly in front of the United Nations Security Council whether North Korean troops were fighting alongside Russian forces, the Russian representative simply refused to answer the question. But the truth could not stay hidden for long. Soldiers were captured alive. Bodies were identified through documents and equipment. Videos and photographs began circulating online. Eventually, the evidence became impossible to deny, and both governments quietly stopped pretending otherwise. Since then, the numbers have only continued to grow. According to South Korean intelligence, close to 11,000 North Korean troops were stationed in Kursk at the start of this year alone, made up of roughly 10,000 combat soldiers and around 1,000 military engineers. Some of the soldiers who survived earlier waves of fighting were sent back home late last year, but multiple reports suggest many of them are now being prepared to return to the front once again. This was never meant to be a one-time favor between allies. It is becoming a repeating cycle, almost like a subscription service for soldiers, paid for in resources, technology, and political loyalty. And the human cost has been absolutely brutal. South Korean intelligence estimates that North Korea has lost around 6,000 soldiers, killed or wounded, in this war alone. British Defense Intelligence reported very similar figures. Take a moment to really sit with that number. 6,000 young men, sent from one of the most isolated, tightly controlled countries on the planet to fight and die in a war that has almost nothing to do with their own homeland, in a conflict most of them were probably never even told the full truth about before they arrived on the front lines. Now, in the summer of 2026, this entire story has taken an even bigger and more alarming turn. Ukraine's president publicly stated that Russia is now asking North Korea for 30,000 more troops. Not a few thousand as reinforcements, 30,000. That number alone would be more than double everything North Korea has already sent since this partnership began. According to this claim, Russia has reportedly been quietly preparing facilities in its Voronezh region since June to receive these new soldiers, a location hundreds of kilometers south of Moscow. deep inside Russian territory, far from the immediate front lines. Moscow has not confirmed this claim. North Korea has not confirmed it either. But the fact that intelligence services and international journalists are taking such a claim seriously tells you something extremely important. Russia's manpower crisis has not been solved by 3 years of fighting. If anything, it appears to be getting worse. Why would Russia possibly need so many more soldiers, especially when the front lines have looked relatively stable for months at a time? The answer lies in simple, brutal math. Modern warfare consumes soldiers far faster than any nation can realistically train replacements. Drones, artillery barrages, and constant grinding combat along hundreds of kilometers of front line create a demand for fresh bodies that never really stops, no matter how the headlines describe the situation on any given week. Russia's own population has been shrinking for years, and its birth rate has continued falling even before this war began. Sending its own young men to die in massive numbers creates serious political risk at home, a risk that Vladimir Putin has worked incredibly hard to avoid ever since the war started. Every funeral quietly held in a small Russian village is a reminder to ordinary citizens of exactly what this war is truly costing their country, one family at a time. North Korean soldiers solve a very specific problem for Russia that money alone simply cannot fix. These soldiers arrive already trained under extremely strict military discipline. They do not have families back home who can protest publicly, organize against the war, or demand answers from their own government. Their government controls nearly every part of their daily lives, from what they are allowed to eat, to what they are permitted to think, to what they are ever allowed to say about the outside world. For Kim Jong Un, sending troops abroad was never simply an act of loyalty toward an old ally. It has become one of the most valuable bargaining tools his regime has ever possessed. And that brings us to the deeper story here, the part that many casual observers of this war are completely missing. This is not simply North Korea generously handing over soldiers out of friendship or shared ideology. This is a calculated trade. And the currency being exchanged is not only money, it is knowledge, technology, and battlefield experience that North Korea could likely never have gained on its own. Recent reports suggest that Russia has allowed North Korean engineers and military officials to closely study and even actively test North Korea's own ballistic missile designs under real wartime combat conditions. Ukrainian intelligence disclosures made public in July of 2026 revealed something genuinely remarkable. That missile accuracy for one particular short-range North Korean ballistic missile model improved dramatically over a short period of time, moving from being wildly off target by several kilometers to landing within just a handful of meters of its intended target. That kind of rapid improvement simply does not happen by accident. It happens through repeated live-fire testing, real combat feedback, and advanced guidance technology that North Korea most likely could not have developed on its own at anywhere near this speed or accuracy. Let that sink in for a moment. North Korea is not merely sending troops to fight in someone else's war. It is actively using that war as a live weapons laboratory to perfect its own missile programs. Every missile fired, every battle fought, every hard lesson learned on a Ukrainian battlefield is quietly being carried back home to sharpen North Korea's own military capability, one test at a time. This should genuinely worry more than just Ukraine and Russia. It should worry every single country that sits within range of a North Korean missile, and that list is a lot longer than most people realize. If you're starting to see just how deeply connected this war really is to the rest of the world, take a moment to like this video right now, and if you haven't hit subscribe yet, this is the moment to do it, because everything you're about to hear next raises the stakes even further. Beyond missiles, there's also enormous amounts of money involved in this partnership. Military analysts estimate that North Korea earned somewhere around $20 billion from Russia through arms shipments alone, between late 2023 and early 2025. Sending tens of thousands of shipping containers filled with artillery shells, rocket systems, anti-tank weapons, and small arms across the border. By early 2026, these shipments had grown even larger, reportedly reaching more than 30,000 containers in total. For a country that has spent decades isolated and heavily sanctioned, struggling at times to even feed its own population, this kind of income is genuinely enormous. It funds the regime directly. It funds weapons development programs. It funds exactly the kind of military modernization that world leaders have spent years and billions of dollars in sanctions enforcement desperately trying to prevent. So here is the real picture, slowly forming right in front of us. Russia gets soldiers to keep fighting a war it clearly cannot end on its own terms. North Korea gets priceless combat experience, advanced weapons testing, and billions of dollars it could likely never have earned through any normal form of international trade. Two isolated, sanctioned powers, each quietly solving the other's biggest problem, at the enormous cost of thousands of lives lost on a battlefield that neither soldier truly chose to be a part of. This partnership was not built overnight, and it did not happen by accident. In 2024, Russia and North Korea formally signed a mutual military assistance treaty, a serious agreement pledging that each country would support the other if either one were ever attacked. This was the clearest signal yet that their relationship had moved far beyond quiet, behind-the-scenes arms deals, and into something that looks much closer to a genuine, formal military alliance. Since then, high-level officials, including North Korea's own foreign minister, have continued visiting Moscow, publicly reaffirming that North Korea's support for Russia's war effort is not temporary and not conditional on anything changing. It is strategic, long-term, and deeply intentional. There is also a quiet third player watching all of this unfold very closely, and that player is China. Beijing has never publicly endorsed sending North Korean troops to fight in Europe, and it has carefully avoided saying much about it at all in public statements. But China's silence is not the same thing as disapproval. North Korea depends heavily on China for trade, fuel, and basic economic survival, and nothing this significant happens without at least some awareness in Beijing. Many analysts believe China is watching this entire arrangement as a kind of live experiment, learning how a modern, drawn-out war actually plays out, how weapons perform under real pressure, and how far international sanctions can really go before they lose their bite. If tensions ever rise sharply around Taiwan or anywhere else in the region, the lessons being quietly learned in Kursk and Voronezh right now will not simply disappear. They will be remembered, studied, and applied elsewhere. Meanwhile, the rest of the world has largely been left reacting rather than actually preventing any of this from happening. South Korea's government, under new leadership, since the middle of 2025, has tried repeatedly to open fresh talks with the North, softening many of its previous demands and shifting away from insisting on complete denuclearization as the very first condition for any dialogue at all. But North Korea, emboldened by its closer ties with both Russia and China, has largely chosen to ignore these diplomatic overtures altogether. Why would it possibly negotiate from a position of perceived weakness when it now has powerful, wealthy allies willing to pay generously for its soldiers and reward it richly for its weapons programs? This is the uncomfortable truth, hiding quietly behind the daily headlines. The war in Ukraine was originally supposed to be a story about one country bravely defending itself against a larger, more powerful invader. Instead, it has slowly, quietly become something much larger and far more complicated, a genuine turning point that is reshaping military alliances across 3 entirely different continents at once. What happens on a muddy battlefield somewhere in Eastern Europe is now directly influencing missile accuracy on the other side of the planet in East Asia. A brutal war fought over land and borders in Ukraine is now directly funding a regime that most of the world had spent decades hoping would simply stay weak, poor, and isolated forever. And if this new request for 30,000 additional troops turns out to be accurate, the scale of this entire partnership moves into territory the modern world has genuinely never seen before. This would not simply be another temporary favor exchanged quietly between 2 friendly governments. It would represent one of the largest transfers of foreign combat troops into a European war. Since the middle of the last century, 30,000 soldiers is not some small symbolic gesture meant to save face. It is an enormous military commitment, the kind that requires massive logistics, transport networks, coordinated training, and serious political will on both sides of this arrangement. It also raises a genuinely difficult question that far too few people seem to be asking loudly enough right now. What exactly does North Korea expect to receive in return this time around? If the first wave of troops helped buy priceless missile testing data and billions of dollars in payments, what would an even larger second wave realistically be worth to Kim Jong Un? Advanced satellite technology, perhaps? Submarine engineering expertise? Deeper battlefield coordination systems and surveillance technology? Every single additional soldier sent to Russia becomes another bargaining chip that Kim Jong Un can use to extract even more from Moscow, and Russia, desperate to keep its entire war machine running smoothly, may have very little real room left to say no to whatever is being asked of it. If this video is giving you a clearer picture of what's genuinely happening behind these dramatic headlines, do something simple for us right now. Share it with someone who still sees this as a distant, disconnected conflict happening somewhere far away. Because the honest truth is, it isn't distant at all anymore, and it hasn't been for quite some time. There's also a deeply human side to all of this that tends to get completely lost in the numbers and the strategic analysis. Thousands of young North Korean men have been sent into a war zone they likely knew almost nothing about beforehand, arriving in a foreign country whose language they could not speak, fighting an enemy they had probably never even heard of until they arrived. Disturbing reports have surfaced, describing soldiers being instructed to use grenades on themselves rather than risk being captured alive. A genuinely chilling reminder of just how tightly controlled and how easily expendable these young lives are treated by their own government back home. These are not simply cold statistics buried inside an intelligence briefing somewhere. They are sons, husbands, brothers, and young men who were given no real choice in any of this. sent to suffer and die far from anyone who might ever truly know their names or mourn them properly. There is also a strange and difficult question waiting on the other side of all this fighting, one that rarely makes it into any headline. What happens to the North Korean soldiers who actually survive and eventually return home? These are men who have now seen modern drone warfare up close, tasted a small amount of the outside world, and experienced combat conditions completely unlike anything in North Korea's own carefully controlled military training. Some analysts believe returning soldiers are kept under intense surveillance once they arrive back home, isolated from the rest of the population, precisely to prevent any outside ideas or information from spreading. Even loyalty forged in blood on a foreign battlefield does not guarantee blind trust from a government built on total control. In a strange way, the very soldiers who helped keep Kim Jong Un's closest ally afloat may end up being treated as a potential risk the moment they come home. For Russia, this entire arrangement also carries serious long-term risks that are far too easy to overlook amid the short-term relief it currently provides on the battlefield. Leaning so heavily on North Korea for basic manpower is not really a solution at all. It is more of a temporary patch. It solves an immediate shortage without addressing the deeper underlying problem, which is that Russia's war effort is consuming resources, both human and financial, far faster than it can realistically and sustainably replace them over time. Relying more and more on a foreign, unpredictable, heavily sanctioned regime just to maintain basic troop numbers is not actually a position of strength at all. It is a quiet, uncomfortable admission of weakness, carefully dressed up and presented publicly as a strong strategic alliance between equals. And for the rest of the watching world, particularly countries scattered across Asia, this should genuinely serve as an urgent warning rather than a distant curiosity to casually observe from a safe distance. A regime that has spent decades under heavy international sanctions and near total isolation is now rapidly gaining real combat experience, dramatically improved missile accuracy, and truly massive financial resources, all through its deep involvement in a war being fought on the completely opposite side of the planet. Weapon systems being quietly refined and tested on Ukrainian battlefields today could very easily be aimed at entirely different targets tomorrow in a completely different region of the world. Military analysts have been remarkably blunt about this exact danger, openly warning that the true long-term beneficiary of this entire war may end up being neither Russia nor Ukraine directly, but North Korea itself quietly walking away from all of this stronger, richer, and considerably more dangerous than when this brutal war first began back in 2022. So where does all of this genuinely leave us today? Two governments that were once widely treated as isolated, unpredictable, and largely ignored on the broader world stage have somehow found in each other exactly what they each desperately needed to survive and grow. Russia found soldiers willing to fight and die in enormous numbers without triggering serious domestic political backlash back home. North Korea found a live, active battlefield to test and dramatically improve its own weapons programs, along with billions of dollars in fresh income to fund its own long-term ambitions, and caught. Directly in between all of this are the soldiers themselves. Thousands of young men whose entire lives have quietly become bargaining chips inside a partnership built almost entirely on shared mutual desperation. If these reports of 30,000 additional troops eventually turn out to be accurate, this will not simply be just another small chapter in the ongoing war in Ukraine. It will be a powerful signal to the entire world that the old, familiar boundaries between separate regional conflicts are steadily disappearing right in front of our eyes. A war that originally started as one country's invasion of its smaller neighbor has slowly and steadily pulled in soldiers, advanced weapons, and deep strategic interests from literally halfway across the entire globe. Whatever happens next in Kursk, or quietly in Voronezh, will simply not stay contained safely within the borders of Russia and Ukraine alone. It will ripple outward, directly into the careful security calculations being made right now in South Korea, Japan, China, and every single nation that has ever quietly worried about what a far stronger, far more battle-tested North Korea might eventually mean for their own long-term national safety. This is genuinely no longer just Putin's war, no matter how the headlines still choose to frame it. It has quietly and steadily become a shared project between two of the most isolated regimes anywhere on Earth, each one actively using the other to survive, to grow stronger, and to buy precious time against a wider world that had sincerely hoped they would simply fade quietly into irrelevance over time. Instead, through shared blood, advanced missiles, and enormous amounts of money, they have built something together that is far more dangerous than either one of them could have ever built entirely alone. And that is the real story hiding behind these dramatic headlines about 30,000 additional troops. It was never really just about raw numbers scattered across some distant battlefield. It was always truly about two desperate, isolated powers finding unexpected strength in each other, at an enormous cost that will likely be measured for many years to come. in lives quietly lost, weapons carefully perfected, and a delicate balance of power spread across the entire world that may never fully return to what it once was before any of this ever began. Years from now, when historians finally sit down to explain how this war truly changed the world, they may spend far less time discussing individual battles or captured towns, and far more time discussing this quiet, uneasy partnership between two isolated regimes that the rest of the world never fully understood until it was already too late to stop it. A request for 30,000 soldiers might sound like just another headline scrolling past on a screen today, but headlines like this one have a way of becoming turning points only when we look back on them, long after the moment to act has already quietly slipped away. If this video genuinely opened your eyes to a side of this war you had never fully considered or understood before today, make absolutely sure you like this video, subscribe right now for more videos exactly like this one, and leave a comment below, telling us what surprised you the most about everything you just learned. Because, honest, conversations like this one are precisely how more people around the world finally start paying real attention to what is actually happening right now, all around them.